Thank you all for being here. It's great to see so many of you here. I'm Ben Hill. I'm with the ATDC, the Business Technology Incubator, which is headquartered on the second floor. I work with entrepreneurs starting clean energy and clean technology companies. And on behalf of my colleagues, I'd like to welcome you to today's program. This is the kickoff of the Georgia Tech Clean Energy Speaker Series. At a time when energy-related issues are so significant, of national security importance, economic development, and greenhouse gas management, the university can serve as a neutral, open forum for their discussion. The goal of this series is to provide an objective, factual, and comprehensive analysis of the Southeast's energy and power requirements to 2030, and to examine the extent to which clean energy technologies can meet some of these demands. Today's program, which is an assessment of regional energy power and demand, will provide a context for the balance of the series. In addition to demand, the series will consider the roles of conservation and efficiency and several clean technologies in terms of scalability, cost, environmental footprint, and availability for deployment. Some of the technology solutions to be considered are biomass conversion, solar, wind, nuclear, and carbon capture and sequestration. The management of greenhouse gases will be considered as well. The intended outcome of this series will be a roadmap for energy and power sources and uses for the Southeast for the next 20 years. For copies of the slides of today's presentations and announcements about future presentations, I would like to steer you to secleanenergy.org, which you can see. The next program on energy conservation efficiency will be held at the same time and location on Wednesday, January 27th. A number of folks have been involved in making this program series possible, and I would like to introduce and thank them. Our major sponsors are Sutherland, an international law firm with its roots here in Atlanta, and the Enterprise Innovation Institute, the economic development arm of Georgia Tech. We have a great board of advisors who I'd like to introduce, who've given us a compelling vision and have also been very involved in implementing that vision. Marilyn Brown, if you'd raise your hand. Or stand up. Marilyn is a professor of public policy here at Georgia Tech and comes to Tech after a distinguished career at Oak Ridge National Laboratory. Valerie Thomas. Valerie is the Anderson Interface Professor of Natural Systems in the School of Industrial Systems Engineering and has a joint appointment in the School of Public Policy. David Schaal. David is the Tenenbaum Chair in the School of Chemical and Biomolecular Engineering, and he's also the Georgia Research Alliance Eminent Scholar in Sustainable Energy. And Jay Hakes. Jay is the director of the Carter Presidential Library and Museum and is the former administrator of the Energy Information Administration. There have been a number of Georgia Tech groups also involved in pulling together this series. They include the Strategic Energy Initiative, the Brooke Byers Institute for Sustainable Systems, and the Georgia Tech Office of Sustainability. So can we just take a second and give these folks a round of applause for their support and help. For today's session, I'd like to introduce Stephen Fleming, who's Vice Provost of Tech's Enterprise Innovation Institute, who has some comments. Following Stephen, Dorothy Franzoni and Tom Warren, co-chairs of the Clean Energy Practice, at Sutherland will have a few comments, and we'll introduce our speakers. And Dorothy and Tom will facilitate the Q&A session also. For those of you participating over the web, and we have quite a few, email your questions to me during that Q&A time, ben.hill@gatech.edu. So thank you very much for being here. I look forward to seeing you at future programs. Stephen?
I'm Stephen Fleming, Vice Provost, Enterprise Innovation Institute, your host today, and I'm thrilled to see so many people coming to this inauguration of this speaker series. We're happy to be a sponsor along with our friends from Sutherland. I'm told that I'm also talking to some people who are not in this room who are listening on a podcast. So those of you who aren't here, I'm waving at you. Welcome electronically. I want to talk very briefly about why Georgia Tech cares about this. I usually start off with the fact that I went to Georgia Tech. I bleed gold and white. When I went here, this was a pretty normal, standard Southern state engineering school, and we weren't that much different from a Clemson or from an Auburn. That's changed. Through the actions of a sequence of presidents at Georgia Tech, we have dramatically increased the research capability of this campus. And so the people who believe that we are still just North Avenue Trade School and still just the engineering school down at the end of the street have missed an enormous transformation that has affected every part of this campus. In the last fiscal year, our fiscal years end on June 30th. For the first time, we exceeded $500 million of sponsored research at Georgia Tech. That's a huge number. When you compare us to other universities, you have to start realizing that just about everybody else in that neighborhood of $500 million of sponsored research has a medical school, which we don't. So we're doing that purely in science, engineering, architecture, computing, technology-related research. One of the things I discovered when I got here, I'm on my third career, I'm not an academic. One of the things that I discovered is I was horrified to find out that 80% of our sponsored research came from the federal government. And having done startups for a living, you don't want any one customer responsible for 80% of your revenue. And so I said, my gosh, what do we do about this? And then I got educated and discovered that the average research university in the United States, that number is 93% federally sponsored and only 7% from industry. So the fact that 20% of our R&D is coming from industry is 3 times the national average. What that means is that the research you find being done at Georgia Tech is more connected to industrial issues and more connected to commercial problems and more connected to, I hate to say it, the real world than you'll find in some other places. I think everybody knows about the phrase, the ivory tower. Well, we've got a tower at Georgia Tech. It's built out of red brick, which is made out of Georgia red clay. And if there's something the opposite of ivory, I suspect it's Georgia red clay. So what you find is that whatever our industrial partners are worried about trickles pretty quickly into what our professors are and our graduate students are researching, which turns into what we in the Enterprise Innovation Institute, as one of our roles, commercialize, because we take it or we help take it from the laboratory to the marketplace, whether that's through creating a startup company or whether that's doing a license agreement or whether that's doing just a consulting operation of some sort. But we try to find ways to turn those inventions into money for businesses and individuals in the state of Georgia. So what we have found is I would love to be able to claim that we had a huge strategic plan several years ago that clean energy and green technology was going to become a big part of Georgia Tech's research future. We can't really make that claim. What happened is a lot of people started asking us for research in those areas, and suddenly we looked up and said, wow, this has actually become an enormous part of our intellectual property practice is clean technologies. So when you look at the deals that we're commercializing, and I don't know where Ben is sitting now, but Ben is right in front of me, that Ben is working on commercializing, we've done deals with solar cells, different ways of doing solar cells. We've done biofuels. wind energy, combustion, just making flat-out combustion burn cleaner. With the smart grid, we have NETRAC here in town, which is a consortium of power utilities. We've done work on conservation and efficiency, which is the next speaker series, or the next element of the series, with cooling of data centers. There's just a huge number of things that have cropped up organically within our research organization. And when we backed up and realized, wow, this is significant to Georgia Tech. So we do have some organizations that have emerged around that, which Ben mentioned several of them is on your advisory council. And now there's the speaker series, which we are thrilled to be inaugurating here today. Glad that you came. For those of you standing in back, it's just like church. There's seats up front. So, come grab a chair. If we need more chairs, we'll get them. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Tom and Dorothy. Are you both coming up? Or I'm not sure who's headed for the microphone. So, turn it over to Dorothy from Sutherland, who's our other co-sponsor. Thanks for doing this. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
Well, thank you, Stephen, and thank you, Ben. Sutherland is very proud to be a sponsor of this speaker series. Sutherland is a national law firm with offices in Atlanta, Washington, D.C., New York, and Houston. And our energy group is comprised of over 50 lawyers who are working with the leaders in the global energy business and here in the Southeast. Our clients, our energy clients, are involved in every aspect of the energy industry, from oil and natural gas to liquefied natural gas, known as LNG, to electric energy, both utilities and independent power producers, and organizations that deal in biofuels, whether it be the production or sale or marketing of biofuels. And all of our energy clients are engaged, actively pursuing clean energy technologies, including wind, solar, biomass, geothermal, nuclear, energy efficiency and conservation programs. And we are, in addition, we have many other clients. Our tax group, our intellectual property, real estate, litigation group represents Fortune 500 companies and many other companies in the Southeast who are also leaders in global business markets and have tremendous needs for energy over the next, 50 to 100 years to both run their businesses and get their products transported to market. So we view this series as a great opportunity to bring in experts to share with business leaders, regulators, legislators, individual consumers here in the Southeast about what the opportunities are for clean energy technologies here in this region of the country and what the challenges may be for implementing those technologies. So we're very proud to be here and appreciate everyone who's here and who's listening in by podcast. So now it's my pleasure to introduce both of our speakers. I'm going to introduce them both. Alan is going to speak first.
No.
Is that right? We switched it? Sorry. Okay. Michael's going to speak first.
It doesn't matter.
So I'll introduce Michael first. Michael Schaal is the director of the Oil and Gas Division at the Energy Information Administration at the U.S. Department of Energy. His primary focus is on producing oil and natural gas and biofuels projections for the EIA's annual energy outlook. His prior experience includes working as a professional engineer with Bechtel Corporation in San Francisco, where he was involved in economic analysis, engineering, construction, and operations of first-of-a-kind facilities, and as a consultant with Energy Ventures Analysis, Inc., advising clients on natural gas and power sector issues. He received his BS in electrical engineering from the California State University in 1986 and his master's degree in mineral economics from Penn State in 1995. He has also admitted to me that he is a former owner of hybrid and other electric and alternatively fueled cars, but no longer is. That may be a subject we could cover during the Q&A session. Our second speaker is Alan Beamon, Director of the Coal and Electric Power Division at the Energy Information Administration at the U.S. Department of Energy. He has worked on electricity analysis projects since 1984. His responsibilities include the development and maintenance of coal, renewable, and electric components of the EIA's National Energy Modeling System, And Michael tells me that it's Alan's model tends to hog all of the resources that there are at the EIA for this work. This is used each year to produce the annual energy outlook, which provides projections through 2030 of energy consumption and prices. It's also used to prepare special studies, including those requested by Congress or the administration. Key areas of his analysis have included the development of National SO2 Allowance Database and the analysis of the impacts of the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990. More recently, his work is focused on the impact of proposed environmental regulations on the electricity sector, especially efforts to reduce nitrogen oxide, sulfur dioxide, mercury, and carbon dioxide. Alan received his degree in economics from the College of William and Mary in 1982. Please join me in welcoming both of our speakers, and initially Michael Schaal. Thank you.
Thank you, Dorothy. Once again, my name is Michael Schaal with Energy Information Administration. And just to give you a little bit of background, Alan will follow up and give additional background. The Energy Information Administration, if you haven't already heard from Jay Hakes, is an independent agency located within the Department of Energy. And with its legislation, it is responsible for providing unbiased data and analysis and forecasting of energy markets to the Congress, President, and the public at large. As such, my comments and the slides that I'll be showing represent EIA's data analysis or viewpoints and do not necessarily represent Department of Energy, the administration, or any other group. So we'll get the correct presentation going. That one right there. Yep. F5, and we're ready to go. So I'll be starting out by discussing the outlook for liquid fuels and natural gas to 2030. And this really is, just in the title, a change that has occurred within the industry within the last couple years. In 2005, 2006, we would have been talking only about petroleum, and ethanol was just a minor component. Now we're considering not just biofuels, but also gas to liquids, coal to liquids, and other forms of producing liquid fuels for consumption. I'll also be discussing prospects for natural gas, because in any of the projections looking at a future with cap and trade or even without cap and trade, natural gas becomes an important consideration when considering the economic viability of one or more alternatives to natural gas for meeting future energy demand. Now, one of the things that we do with our annual energy outlook each year is we consider a range of scenarios. And here I show the price scenarios. But really, when you open up our annual energy outlook, you'll see that there are a multitude of scenarios, upwards of 60 or more different cases that are run and that we publish. And this is because when we consider the future, we know that there are several important unknowns about how the future may transpire. So when we consider a future that includes a consideration of oil prices, we consider the full range from what if oil prices in 2030 were $50 per barrel in 2007 dollars, up to $200 per barrel in 2007 dollars. For the purposes of introducing what we do, I'll be considering what we call a reference case projection for the most part, which is a oil price of $130 per barrel, or this red line that you see here, by 2030. Now, when we consider the future of energy use within the economy, we look at the end-use efficiency trends. In particular, when we're modeling end-use efficiency trends, we break this down to the lowest level possible that we find within our energy use surveys and the data that we collect. But essentially, when you add all of this up, when you look back from history, we've become, as represented by the blue line here, more energy efficient in terms of how much energy is needed per dollar of real gross domestic product produced. And if you ran this line back to the 1970s, we actually produce, for the same amount of GDP, for about half the amount of energy input into the economy. So that's been quite an achievement in terms of our ability to grow the economy with less energy. However, the red line shows a slightly different story, which is on a per capita basis, we essentially are using about the same amount of energy per person than we did back to 1990. And if you brought this back to the 1970s, it's still about the same amount of energy per person as we consume now. Looking towards the future, however, while our ability to wring additional energy efficiency out of the system still exists on an economic basis, we're actually starting to see, with the advent of additional CAFE standards and other measures in end-use efficiency, an outlook where we actually show a decrease or an improvement in energy efficiency per person, a savings of up to 11% by 2030 as compared to 2007 levels. So that as one consideration, and ongoing growth of the economy as another consideration, we show that total energy consumption within the United States, which is shown here broken down by the individual fuels, increases by a total of 9% between 2007 and 2030, a growth rate of about 0.4% per year, which is less than the population growth rate. Of this, as you can see, renewables, which includes hydroelectric power, remains a relatively low constituent of the total energy supply picture, but actually is increasing at about 12% over that time frame, with non-hydro renewables increasing at a faster rate. Biofuels, as represented by this hatched line here, is increasing nearly 400% over that same time frame. In the Southeast, we're showing essentially the same type of growth, where the Southeast is expected to grow its total consumption of fuels by 11%, major growth or a substantial growth in nuclear of about 23% between 2007 and 2030, biofuels over 400%, and in liquid fuels, in general, exclusive biofuels of 5%. Natural gas consumption within the Southeast is actually expected to remain fairly flat or decrease slightly between 2007 and 2030. Now, with regards to liquid fuels, what we're really focused on is what's happening in the transportation sector. In particular, how, for example, new light-duty vehicle sales trends are going to proceed in the future. As you can see from this chart, which tracks the percentage of total sales of new vehicles between 1990 through 2030 in various vintages, I don't know what side to pick this up with, but as you can see, from 1990 through 2007, we've had, as everyone knows, a rather major increase in the market share of sport utility vehicles, which on a projection basis is actually only declining somewhat slightly through about 2030. On the other hand, subcompact vehicles, their market share of new light-duty vehicle sales has decreased over time and is expected to increase only slightly through 2030. And this reflects consumer preferences for the types of vehicles they would like to drive and the vehicles that they can afford to drive. When we look at ways that we can improve energy efficiency of this vehicle stock, what we're looking at is opportunities for improving the miles per gallon of the fleet. And one way, as represented through the yellow portion of these bars, is through increased use of diesel. High-efficiency diesel vehicles, which actually have a fairly large market share in Europe, exhibit a fairly good energy efficiency. However, there are certain issues with American consumers being able to adopt or accept diesel vehicles as a clean technology. In addition, we have an increasing share of flex fuel vehicles, or an increasing sales of flexible fuel vehicles. And these are vehicles that can burn either gasoline or blends of up to 85% ethanol with gasoline. And these vehicles are actually historically been sold to help manufacturers meet CAFE standards. We also show two different types of hybrid vehicles. The one in the light blue is the mild hybrid electric vehicles, and these are along the lines of your Honda Civic, where the electric assist isn't integrated with the drivetrain, as opposed to a full hybrid electric vehicle where the motive power is supplied entirely by the electric drive itself. But as you can see, those vehicles are increasing rather rapidly through the projection. Dorothy had asked about or some people had asked about our views about plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. And within the outlook that we provided, released in December of a year ago, we show some increase in sales of those plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, but not necessarily a massive increase of sales. So with that projection of the advanced vehicles and a consideration of the macroeconomic growth, we then consider what the total liquid fuels demand in transportation is. And what we find is that while we've shown an increase from about 1981 to 2007 of 45% increase in total liquid fuels consumed within the U.S., looking out through 2030, we actually show fairly level growth in consumption, an total increase of only 4% between 2007 and 2030. And that's also reflected in the totals as well. Now, this is reflective of the total macroeconomic growth rates of 2.4% per year between 2007 and 2030, an increase of vehicle miles traveled of 42%, total of 42% over that time frame, and a total increase in per capita real disposable income of 48% over that time frame. So this is really to maintain a constant level of volume consumed of liquid fuels is actually fairly remarkable given these other increases that are occurring that would tend to increase consumption. Now, consumption is only one part of the story. At least that's my story, since I and mostly responsible for modeling supply. So with this consumption trend, which reflects the current macroeconomic downturn and recovery, we show a narrowing in our net import dependency. And actually this narrowing, which had been growing in a historical fashion since the 1970s, had been as high as 60% in 2006. In 2007, we have it down at 58% and projected out to decrease to 40% under our reference case assumptions. And that is driven by a number of issues. One, of course, is our fairly stable consumption pattern, but also an increase in supply. And the increase in supply is occurring for two different reasons. First of all, we acknowledge that there's been essentially a greater than 60% drop in our onshore domestic crude oil production between 1970 and 2007. However, new technologies are being deployed that, under our reference case oil price projections, not just arrest that decline, but actually cause additional supplies to be brought online. In addition, as we go further out into the Gulf of Mexico, we're expecting additional production from the lower 48 offshore. In addition, this AEO 2009 reference case includes the rescinding of the moratoria that had been applied to both the Pacific and Atlantic coasts. And so those areas are assumed to be available for production, and a small amount of production does occur from both coasts in that case. Now, we're often asked, well, why do you think the future for the domestic onshore crude oil production would be any different than this past downward trend? And it's really the new technologies. So we have what are called enhanced oil recovery technologies, which are increasing in use over this projection period. In particular, what you may have heard about is this process called CO2 enhanced oil recovery process, where essentially the CO2 is taken and injected into the well bore, and at the temperature and pressure down there, this gas becomes a liquid and becomes essentially like a solvent and helps sweep away or sweep to the well bore, another well bore, this crude oil that had otherwise been left behind by other crude oil production techniques. And this allows for additional recovery of oil than would have otherwise been possible. Now, within current practice, the major source of supply of CO2 comes from natural sources. We actually mine CO2, produce it, send it by pipeline, and send it down into a wellhead. And as the CO2 comes back up, we put it back down in the ground, but eventually we do have to consume CO2. There are a few manufacturing facilities, many of which are located along the Gulf Coast, which are used to capture the CO2 for use in this technology. And indeed, in our projection, our ability to supply this extraction technology with natural sources of CO2 comes to an end, and we find that we encourage manufacturing facilities to capture CO2 for use in this process. In addition, in the outer years, we have a small amount of oil shale that's brought online. I see at least one smiling face for someone who has a little bit more gray hair than I do, but oil shale has always been the technology of the future, and it is still out there in the future. But we do, at $130 per barrel level, show some production from oil shale. Now shifting a little bit to what happens to our what's called product slate, or how we consume these liquid fuels. In 2007, we show that the share of motor gasoline to diesel to other types of distillate fuels and the amount that is being supplied by biofuels on this chart. And this right here would give you an indication of the types of products that refineries are being called upon to provide or make up from imports of these products. Now, as we go out into the future, and remember we were talking about total consumption being relatively flat, what we're showing is that biofuels become a larger proportion of what is consumed. As a result, we have a change or a shift in the products being supplied in terms of percentage of what's being required out of the refinery. In addition, this additional macroeconomic growth is calling for more diesel. And as a result, biofuels, which predominantly offset motor gasoline, is resulting in motor gasoline actually that's supplied by petroleum sources actually declining by a small amount through 2030, whereas the diesel is increasing, the biofuels are increasing. As a result, our refineries are having to reconfigure in order to meet this different product slate. Now, one of the reasons why we're consuming more biofuels is a combination of a blender's tax credit, which has helped start a whole industry, which is largely fueled by corn ethanol or supplied by corn ethanol. But after 2010, we assume this blender's tax credit is not renewed, and that what's called a renewable fuel standard, or RFS, which was updated in 2007, would drive biofuels production throughout the forecast projection period. In particular, the renewable fuel standard consists of 4 nested standards. There's an overall standard that calls for 36 billion gallons of biofuels by 2022, and that's represented by this black line. But there's also a separate standard that asks for advanced biofuels, which is essentially anything other than corn ethanol. And then within that, there's a requirement to provide cellulosic biofuels, which by 2022 calls for 16 billion gallons of that type of fuel. And then as an additional adder, there's a separate requirement for biomass-based diesel. So when you add these up, the total is supposed to come to 36 billion gallons. But when we analyze what industry may be capable of building between now and 2022, we show that we're probably going to come at something less than 36 billion gallons. And in our projection here, 29 billion gallons by 2022. And it consists of the 15 billion gallons of corn ethanol, some cellulosic ethanol, ethanol from feedstocks such as sweet sorghum and jatropha and some other non-corn grains, some from ethanol imports. Cane ethanol counts as an advanced biofuel. And then also some renewable diesel, such as the ConocoPhillips proposal with Tyson's to use white grease, or basically chicken fat, run it through a refinery. However, even though we don't make the 36 billion gallons in 2022, we do show that with this level of increase in production, the costs of these production technologies gets driven down to the point where there's a crossover, and some of these technologies, in addition to corn ethanol, become viable, and we continue to grow those industries. Now, within the Southeast, we're showing that the contribution from the Southeast can be as much as 3 billion gallons, potentially more. Now, the Southeast is not known for growing much corn, and therefore hasn't been a major player in the biofuels market. However, the Southeast is a player in these second-generation biofuels. First of all, there's the woody biomass, some cane, and some other crops that are available for producing biofuels. And secondly, there's a willingness that we observed in some of the states to cite and permit and make it easier for entrepreneurs to develop their technologies within the region. We show that the cellulosic ethanol is the major constituent. However, whether or not cellulosic ethanol is produced, or what we are calling biomass to liquids, which is essentially taking the biomass supply, gasifying it, and then producing a distillate product, that is a different issue, because with ethanol, what you end up with is a product that has less than 70% of the energy content as gasoline and must be shipped oftentimes separately from gasoline to the region where it's going to be consumed, where it's then mixed and then delivered to your retail pump. Whereas with this Fischer-Tropsch distillate product, you produce a diesel which then can be dropped into the existing distribution infrastructure. So that's one advantage. Second advantage is this diesel has a higher heat content than the ethanol, and under the renewable fuel standard schedules counts 50% more than ethanol towards meeting the standard. So there's the trade-off between the capital investment and the fact that the non-cellulosic ethanol technologies are perhaps starting further back than the cellulosic ethanol technologies, but there are certain advantages to the one technology versus the other. So this particular forecast is a proxy, perhaps, of what actually might be or might become. Now I'm going to switch a little bit to natural gas, and I'm going to start out with our AEO 2009 price projection. And one of the reasons why I'm going to do this is just to show just the range of volatility that has occurred within the natural gas markets, which mirrors that of the oil markets, which in our projection increase slightly, but nowhere to the extent of the increase that would be indicated by our oil prices rising to $130 per barrel. And I'll get to that in a minute, the reasons behind that. When we think about natural gas supply, what we acknowledge is that, like oil, we have conventional sources which are on the decline. This non-associated conventional natural gas, where you just went out, drilled a hole in the ground, and up came natural gas, is in decline. In addition, imports from Canada are in decline, and over time we've become less optimistic, I guess is one way to put it, about our ability to bring significant amounts of liquefied natural gas to the U.S. In competition with other potential consumers of LNG. We also have the offshore natural gas production, which is actually increasing, mirroring our offshore production of oil. We have Alaskan gas pipeline coming in to this projection, which allows for some increase there. But the lion's share really is this unconventional production to meet our demand. in talking about demand, one of the factors we look at is the decrease in industrial consumption of natural gas, which has occurred since the mid-1990s, is expected to level out, partly because of the fact that natural gas is a bit cheaper than oil for fueling different processes. In addition, we have certain gas consumption required to produce such things as ethanol and other types of alternative fuels. Really, the action or the sensitivity has to do with electric generation. And this is where pricing then matters. So depending on what the outlook is for pricing determines whether or not we have a decrease in the utilization of existing gas-fired generation, as shown here, followed by an increase, or whether that might actually increase and displace other types of electric generation. In the Southeast, this particular phenomenon is amplified in that electric generation, gas use in electric generation is a larger component than even industrial generation since 2000. So once again, back to production. As shown in this chart, it's the unconventional that has really driven our ability to produce more natural gas in the U.S., offsetting our declines in conventional. And the unconventional is comprised of three different components, one of which, the coal bed methane. Many of these projects were stimulated by certain tax policies, which allowed them to experience some rapid growth. We also had growth in gas produced from tight sands formations, which required different stimulation techniques in order to bring this gas production to levels that were economic. But more recently, what most people have heard about has been the rapid increase in gas shales and gas shale production. And as a result of this increase in unconventional production and a fairly stable consumption pattern, we're showing a decline in our need to import natural gas. Our imports actually decrease to becoming no more than 2% of our consumption needs by 2030. Now, in terms of where these gas shale plays are at, they're essentially everywhere. This chart, which is available from EIA, and I've seen reproduced in a number of reports and presentations, show the extent at which the Barnett, which is the where this technology originated, has expanded and been proven in other areas of the country, including most notably recently in the Haynesville area in the southeast, and the Marcellus up in along the Mid-Atlantic region. But this is one area of resource development that is still in quite a bit of flux. As you can see here, as represented by the yellow band here of shale gas, the unconventional resource constitutes our largest portion of our expected resource base for producing natural gas. However, we're still discovering where we can produce even more shale gas. So whereas 5 years ago we might have had no more than 90 TCF, 90 trillion cubic feet of gas shale resources, now we're showing with 8U 2009 nearly 270 TCF, and some analysts have estimated that this 267 TCF is off by a factor of 2. And that's just because we haven't yet found out where we can produce this type of gas from all the known shale plays. And that's highlighted in this chart here, which pulls from an organization known as the Potential Gas Committee, which once every 2 years provides an assessment of what is known to be technically recoverable resource of natural gas. And as shown here in 1986, the estimate came in at slightly over 1,200 trillion cubic feet. In the intervening years, that estimate actually stayed fairly constant over time, increasing only slightly until in 2006, when they began counting gas shales as a technically recoverable resource, there was a substantial increase. And then with their most recent assessment, their estimate was of more than 2,000 TCF of technically recoverable resource for natural gas in the U.S. Now, what's even perhaps more dramatic is to consider if we had just started out with the 1986 estimate of how much gas was available, and instead in each year subtract the amount that we produced from that resource, you would end up with what I'm showing here is the green line, such that by 2008 we would have had no more than a third of the gas remaining that we estimated in 2006 that we now expect is available to us to produce in 2008. And this trend of being able to overcome our cumulative production that has occurred is a result of our improvements in technologies for finding the resource, for producing the resource using such techniques as horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing. Okay. And I'm told I'm near the end of my time, which is great because this is my last slide. Alan will be up here to discuss more about issues having to do with how the future might look under different scenarios such as greenhouse gas legislation. But with regards to natural gas, one of the issues that we're often faced with is, well, with all this gas resource base, why don't we use a whole bunch of gas under a cap and trade or some other climate change legislation? And then this chart shows the results of this was Lieberman-Warner, but you might as well Lieberman-Warner 2191. But these results pretty much mirror what happens to natural gas under a wide range of these bills, and that is we don't necessarily see a dash to gas under these under this legislation because there are alternatives to natural gas, and these alternatives often produce much less carbon dioxide than natural gas. So as a result, natural gas might become a larger market share of electricity generation, but given that consumption might be lower due to energy efficiency or decreased and other decreased consumption drivers, we end up with a fairly, as compared to our reference case, a fairly narrow range of consumption in the outer years. Okay? So to summarize my presentation, we're expecting continued macroeconomic growth rate, increased energy consumption, But there are a number of subtleties when thinking about the future with regards to energy consumption and supply. So thank you very much, and I'll toss it over to Alan.
Dropping it right from the very get-go. Am I on there somewhere?
I think so.
All right. Here you go. Good afternoon. How are y'all doing? Hope everybody's doing pretty well. First of all, I want to thank Ben for inviting us. I'm sure Jay Hakes had some input into that, given his experience at EIA. So I really appreciate the opportunity to come down and talk to you all today. I noticed in the introduction that this is your kickoff of your clean energy speaker series, and that one of the earlier speakers who talked about what this series is all about is saying that you really want to have this open series that talks about what can we really do and what's really important and how and not taking any particular position and things like that. And I think that the work that we do at EIA really sort of fits into that. I've been there since, unfortunately, as my bio mentioned, since 1984. So I've been there a long time. I've been there since, a lot of changes. Mike's one of our newer people, and as he always accuses me of taking all the resources in our modeling work and our analysis work, I let him go first today. But I'll talk a little bit about our reference type work that Michael talked about. But what I'm really going to focus on is what has been occupying all of my time, probably for the last decade, at least since Kyoto has been on anybody's dream list, is our work in terms of climate change analysis that we've been asked to do by a lot of people. But I'll mention that I do like coming down to the South. My parents are both from North Carolina. They're the only siblings of theirs that left North Carolina because my dad joined the Navy. So it's nice to come down here and hear people that talk a little bit like them. But since I was born in San Diego, I don't know anything about the South. And, when we were moving around the coast, I tell people that I'm a coastal kid because all I know about the middle of the United States is we crossed it when we went from one military Navy base to another. But other than that, I always lived on the coast. My mother is actually from Mount Airy, North Carolina. For those that know that, that's actually the Mayberry RFD home. Andy Griffin lived around the corner from my mother. And so I every once in a while I go back there. They have a Mayberry days and things like that. But most of my time I've spent on the coast. I ended up in Virginia because my dad's last posting was at the Pentagon, where they all hate it, so they retire and get out of the military. But I'm going to talk a little bit about a lot of work that I've done in terms of climate change stuff. Mostly our most recent analysis, which was on the Waxman-Markey proposal. We're now looking at Kerry Boxer and other things, but it keeps us busy. And the reason I'm going to talk about that is I haven't had time to think about anything else. So with that, I was supposed to go first, so I'll talk a little bit about EIA. And I can't not mention, since we're at an educational institution that has a very big quantitative background, that EIA is a great place to work. So all you college kids out there that are thinking about, particularly people who think about numbers and think about how they might, and given this current job environment, we will be looking for people. For a couple of reasons. EIA was formed in the earlier energy crises. We have an awful lot of people that are leaving because they came to EIA in the late 70s and early 80s. And so there is an awful lot of people that are looking for other places to go in their lives at this point. So we're looking for new people. We're looking for people that have strong quantitative backgrounds, economics, engineering, math, OR. That's the people that I hire. So I would encourage you to try to look at things that we might be doing. As Michael mentioned, we're a statistical agency within the Department of Energy. We produce an awful lot of reports just on, we have one group that focuses mostly on all of their data collection surveys, but where Michael and I work, it's mostly in the long-term analysis associated with the annual energy outlook. And I've provided you all these linkages that you can get in my presentation to where material is available from EIA. And the one you probably want to look at the most is this area right here is where we produce what we call service reports, is all the reports that Congress asks us about for climate change. I also run our renewable group, and we've done an awful lot of renewable portfolio standards, even though nobody calls it portfolio anymore. That's a bad word, since the financial community, screwed us all. So now they call it clean energy standards and renewable energy standards or electricity standards. They don't use the word portfolio anymore. Somebody told me that's why they changed it, but I have no idea if that's really true. But I have the renewable group. We've done an awful lot of those. Those are all posted there. So we keep ourselves busy, and I hope we get a chance, some of our other analysts get a chance to come down and talk in your series, because I think we might have some inputs that really would help you out there. So I'm going to talk about electric power and what's been going on. I'm going to start with a little bit about what's been driving the industry in the last few years, and then I'm going to move forward to talking about our most recent analysis of Waxman-Markey, because I think that really, is sort of what's going to happen with efforts to try to reduce greenhouse gas emissions is really a big area, and that's what's going to drive electricity over the next decade or two. But if you've been around in the power business for the last few years, this is what you've been faced with. Prices have been rising, both for fuels and for power plants. And so everybody's struggling with, well, what are we going to do with those sorts of costs? Now, these things scare me as a long-term forecaster, because whenever anybody sees these, they want to go, oh, you got to triple everything. But these things have gone this way, and they've gone this way. And when you see these really rapid changes, you worry about, is this a shift, or is this something that's going to correct itself over a few years? And to be honest with you, I don't know. And it's hard. And as you see in the CERA index, costs have started to moderate. But will they start to come back down to anything like they were when people were talking to us 5 or 10 years ago? I don't know. And that's difficult. And you see this here, that's also pushed prices up. You look at this, these are nominal prices. And for all you quantitative people, that means when they're nominal and they've been flat, that means in real terms they've really been falling for quite a while. Electricity prices were falling for many years since the 80s, and only in the last few years in real terms they started rising. But they have, and people are concerned about that. There's also a lot of other regulatory activity that's been going on. From mercury rules, NOx and SOx control rules, they vacated, they bring them back. So I've had to struggle with a lot of that sort of stuff. The CARE is in our forecast, but again, these are sort of minor when you compare them to potential climate change legislation. Now, as Michael mentioned, we have a lot of cases in our annual energy outlook. The only one anybody ever talks about is the reference case. And I try to discourage that, because if you're looking out beyond 1 or 2 years, uncertainty is the name of the game. And so you better evaluate any investment you're going to make over more than just a single scenario and say, does this still make sense? Every once in a while somebody calls me up and says, well, can you tell me the natural gas price in 2025? And I'll give them a range, and they'll say, no, I just want one number. And then I'll find out they work for a bank or something. They're evaluating some investment. And it scares me to death. I'm like, I want to get rid of that stock as fast as I can. Because anybody thinks I can tell you the price of natural gas with any confidence in 2025 to the cents is scary. But we do a lot of these. We do technology scenarios. We do various policy scenarios. We do things looking at higher plant costs, lower plant costs. And only because these are really unknowns, and they're important. And you need to look at those when you're thinking about these things. Now, you notice this green case here. The reason I highlighted this is because Congress, this is what everybody calls the stimulus bill, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, the ARA, as we're sort of the common vernacular that we use. And we ended up having to do a different reference case, because this came out just after we published our annual energy outlook last year. And since there was so money involved in it, particularly for renewables, we updated it. And so that's what most of our current analysis is based on, starts from that as the base case, because it has that in it. Now I'm going to talk about a couple trends that might be important to you, because I know you all were, one of the focuses of this was demand. Unfortunately, when we found that out, we said, well, Michael and I, neither one of us are on the demand sides of our model, but we can talk about it a little bit. Both of us are supply things. But in the electric power business, this is a big thing that's been going on for many, many years. Demand, while it grows, it's been slowing. That's for a lot of reasons. You can imagine back in the 60s and 70s, people were still adding all these electric appliances that you and I have never known life without. You know, air conditioning and all of that stuff. Well, all that's, you know, one, it's pretty much penetrated the market, and the newer stuff's a lot more efficient. And population growth is not growing as fast anymore. And so while demand keeps growing, it keeps slowing. And so as you can see in our current projections, we're a little bit below 1% a year through 2030. Now, when you look at the generation fuel mix, this is just the reference case. You can see on the bottom, coal plays a big role, and we expect it to continue to play a big role, but not grow very much. While it's hard to sort of see when you look at these sort of things, the big growth is in, you got renewables up here. You compare this number to this number, you see that in percentage terms it grows quite a bit. And then you also have natural gas growing, whereas nuclear and others are pretty stable. Now, I did do the same thing for the Southeast. The interesting thing, from the coal base, you're pretty similar to the country, to the nation. The place where you're different from the nation is a bigger share of nuclear. Again, you see growth. Here's your renewable. It's growing. And I'm going to explain a little bit why we have natural gas falling in the near term and then rising later, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later. Now, here's this issue I made about prices, that for many years, in real terms, they were falling since the 80s. And suddenly, in real terms, they shot back up. Nominal, they were flat for an awful long time, and we have them rising. But in real terms, we have them falling a little bit in the near term and then rising again. Why are they falling in the near term? Because fuel prices have fallen an awful lot in the last couple of years now after they peaked very high, and we expect that eventually to find its way to power prices. But what's going to change? These are all analysis my group has been working on. Renewable fuel standard, production tax credits, appliance standards, CAFE over here, corporate average fuel, investment tax credits, and I still have portfolio in there. I got to fix that slide. It's a bad thing. But it's all dominated by greenhouse cap and trade programs. I've been doing this since we did Kyoto analysis. Lieberman Warner was the one that Michael mentioned, but our latest one was Waxman Markey. So I am going to talk about that a little bit. So I won't go through all these. You can read the major provisions. The big driving force in the Waxman-Markey bill is the cap and trade program. A couple other things that might worth mentioning. You know, all of these bills have some sort of clean energy standard, where they require a certain percentage of electricity come from renewables or other clean sources like fossil with carbon capture and storage. And they can be important. But generally, we found that they're not too binding when you have them with a fairly stringent cap and trade program on greenhouse gases. So I'll let you all read that at your leisure. The one thing I want to focus on here is talk a little bit about the key cases that we did, because that's important. There's a lot of uncertainties in trying to look ahead at what climate change legislation might do, particularly in the power sector. And so we tried to address those. And the key ones we thought about when we were looking at Waxman-Markey is, as we started to do some early analysis, we found out is offsets. How many are out there, and what are they going to cost, and how much are going to be available? Because the Waxman-Markey bill, and so does the Kerry-Boxer bill, allow up to 2 gigatons of offsets to be used each year under certain conditions. And that, if that's available, and if they're inexpensive, they could provide an enormous amount of the compliance. But of course, we don't know how certain they are. We don't know how certain the costs are. So we did various assumptions about how much the offsets are and if they're available. From the high offsets case that says you can use as much as they allow you to, and then to the no international where we don't allow you to use international offsets. The other thing is, every analysis I've seen of greenhouse gas analysis in the power sector says you're going to move to some combination of from coal to more renewables, more nuclear, or more fossil with CCS or natural gas. The mix of those depends on the other assumptions you make and what they cost and how they perform. And particularly with nuclear and fossil with CCS, the cost and performance assumptions are really uncertain at this point. They haven't been, nobody's built them in a long time in the case of nuclear, and fossil with CCS, nobody's built them at any scale yet. And so nobody really knows what they're going to cost. So we did them under reference case assumptions, and we also did them assuming they cost 50% more. And I'll show you what that does. Again, these are just summaries, but I can show you these in the slides. You can read through these, but hopefully I'm going to make these points in the slides that follow. I think this is really important, and let me step back here because I think it's easier for me to show these with the pointer. What this is, each one of these little areas is showing you how much of the compliance comes from that particular source. So when you're looking at this dark blue area, that's saying offsets, and this is particularly international offsets. So what this is showing you is through 2030, all of this area, these offsets are accounting for a pretty big chunk, and that's why I was making that point about how important offsets are. And in fact, in our basic case, if you add up the international offsets with the offset, domestic offsets, which are the green in this area here, they account for just about 60% of the compliance under Waxman-Markey. The energy stuff, how much is coming out of energy-related CO2, so this is how much is coming from getting out of coal and going to renewables and CCS in here, is only accounting for the other 40% in the basic case. Now, if we go over to this case over in the corner, this is what we call the high offsets case. As I said, this is where we allow you to use as much offsets as the bill allows you to use. So that's at up to 2 gigatons a year. So you can see here, this is where you immediately pop up and use all of the international offsets, and you use a lot of domestic too. In this case, domestic emissions reductions, these two areas here, are only accounting for 22% of the compliance over that whole period. Most of it's coming from offsets. The key thing to note about this, so this, when you see people's analyses out there of Waxman-Markey or Kerry-Boxer that are saying they're very low cost, it's generally because this is what's happening. They're getting very high penetration of offsets at very low cost, and so that's where you get the low cost scenarios. On the other hand is over here. So what if offsets either aren't available, they're very costly, they can't work out all the licensing rules and other things like that that might constrain them, and so you have to do most of it domestically. That's what's happening here. Then you get to a mix like that, you don't have the international offsets, and the costs are much higher. So how much higher? So here is our projected allowance prices. So if you can utilize as much of the offsets as you're allowed, and they're fairly inexpensive, we have the allowance price only growing to about $40, $41 to be specific. In our basic case, they grow up to about $65. At the other end of that spectrum is if no international offsets are not there, and nuclear and coal with CCF and other technologies are quite expensive. And when I say quite expensive, in this case, nuclear is about $5,000 a kilowatt. Those are the kind of numbers people talk about today. They're not quite sure, but that's what they're talking about. That's $191. So it shows you the range of impacts of those key assumptions. And we try to do this because we're trying to show what sort of impacts the different key assumptions have on the report. So I'm going to, again, these are here for your summary. I'll let you read them and get to those later. So let's look. Demand. This is what we have. As you can see, demand's been slowing, as I showed in that earlier chart. In the 90s, it was about 2.4%. And then in the first through 2007 of this decade, it's already, and this doesn't include the recession. If you were to go to 2009 now, it would be even lower because of the recession is in there. So this is before you really had the big impacts. The recession had already slowed to that, and this is what we have in our reference case, is this slightly under 1.9. So in all of the various cases we did of Waxman-Markey, it's quite a bit slower. Even in this is the high offsets case where the allowance prices really aren't very high. But still, it goes down from 0.9 to 0.7. And the reason for that is Waxman-Markey does have a lot of programs in there to stimulate investment and efficiency, even if the allowance price, the price effect isn't very big. So in that case, the price effect's not very big. What's driving it is various programs where they take the allowance revenue and invest in efficiency. On the other hand, you look at this case over here, it gets down really low, and that's because it's driven by the impact of the higher energy prices, pushes efficiency up. Now, here's the generation mix. So what happens under all these scenarios? The black, and Microsoft picked this. I did not make coal black. I just put the orders in here, and that's what it did. People accused me of making coal black, but I didn't. That's just where it picked it. And so you see in our reference case, here's coal in 2007. It grows a little bit through 2030. Even though coal has slowed quite a bit, and they're not adding too many. They are adding quite a big slug of coal right now, more than they've added in the last 20 or so years. They're adding about 15, 16 gigawatts of coal. And eventually that grows and the generation grows. So in our basic case, that it falls significantly. Now this is coal without CCS, this is coal with CCS. And so if you look at the total coal generation, it falls from here to here. It would fall, you have to move out of coal if you're really going to cut the emissions to the levels. And then this is even though you're using quite a few offsets here to comply. On the other hand, if you can't rely on the offsets, and so you have to do it almost all domestically, you almost entirely move out of coal by 2030. And what do you go to? Mainly, you see these big increases. If you don't constrain nuclear, you get a lot of nuclear. On the other hand, if nuclear is much higher cost than we expect, then you only get a modest increase in nuclear. You get a lot more renewables moving up here from the reference case. And if you don't, you end up moving into, now Michael talked about natural gas. What happens to natural gas? You see in most of these cases, natural gas goes down from the reference case level, with the exception of this case. So this says if nuclear, coal with CCS, are really just not very available through 2030, and you have to rely, you move heavily to natural gas and renewables. And so that generally we don't see a big, what people often talk about as a dash to gas. You hear that term somewhat. I remember back in Kyoto analysis when we were doing this back in the late 1990s of the Kyoto Protocol, people generally you would see one of the compliance options would be in the near term to move from coal to natural gas. But you got to remember, the target in Kyoto was only 7% below 1990. It didn't keep going to 80% below. And the other thing is back in the early 1990s, the projections for natural gas prices were under $3 forever. So you could meet those kind of modest targets by going to natural gas, and it was inexpensive. Nowadays, the targets are much more severe, and the price of natural gas is higher. So you generally can't get there as easy by going to natural gas, and most people don't project you'll see a huge dash to gas, unless these other options either are unavailable or very expensive. And so that's what does that. So this shows this sort of parallels the generation mix is what do you build. And there's two things I'll point out here. One, so this is how much capacity we're building in the reference case. It's in the closing in on 250 gigawatts. You notice in these, except for the either you don't build a bank or you can rely heavily on offsets, you build a lot more capacity. Because you have to build not only to meet demand growth, you have to build to replace the coal plants that you retire. And so you end up with a huge investment growth in the power sector having to build more capacity in these cases. This does not happen if you can rely so heavily on the offsets, because you're reducing U.S. emissions, but not as much otherwise. And then the other thing is, so what do you build? Generally, we found nuclear very attractive. The question is, could you build that much nuclear today? 96 gigawatts by 2030. That's about what we have today. So we're saying we're doubling it. We did build 100 gigawatts between 1970 and 1990. That's how much capacity of nuclear we built. So it's not an engineering issue. We built that much before. We built that much when we had a much smaller economy. But can we? I don't know. Permitting, approval, all those issues that might come along, it might not be possible. So if you look at the higher cost one, we're only building 14 or 15 gigawatts, but then we move real heavily into renewables and even some in CCS. Generally, the thing that's really stimulating the CCS investments is the special allowance pools for CCS. If that's not in there, we generally would not move to CCS. We'd find it more expensive. We'd move to more renewables or nuclear, but not the CCS. It really makes those bonus pools are very important for CCS. So then look what happens over here when you don't have all those. You really, really go heavily into renewables. And now one reason this happens when you go into renewables too is you're building a lot of wind and you don't get as much capacity credit out of wind, so you even have to build more capacity. That's why it happens when you get so much. Now the electricity prices, you might be saying, why aren't they exploding? before 2025. And the reason they're not is because the bills call generally for giving a good chunk of allowances to the LDCs through 2025, then they're phased out starting in 2025. And those allowances are supposed to be used to mitigate bills to consumers or costs to consumers, and so that dampens any energy. So energy price, electricity price increases are about 3 to 4% in this range. But then after 2020, 2025, they start to rise as those allowance distributions are removed, and they're about 20% higher in our basic case and as much as 77% higher in the limited no international case. Same pattern for Southeast. I just wanted to show those to you. So, if you have any issues, you can call me. There's Maya. One thing I note here is my first name is Joseph. As a good Southern boy, they never called me that. I would have been the third. So they always called me Alan, but I will answer. It'll be a pause because I have to think about it. But that is my email, Joseph Beamon. I always think about change. They would change it to Alan if I told them to. But the reason I know I don't is because when somebody starts with Joseph, I know I don't know them. So it's sort of a screening device. Well, thank you very much. If you have any questions. I guess we should keep this on. You want us to sit up here? Yeah. Because I'll.
I guess, yeah, this is turned on. So we have a few minutes to do Q&A with both of our speakers. And so wanted to ask a show of hands and see who we can get started with. Yes, this gentleman right here. Sorry, just to explain, we need to speak into the microphone so that the people who are listening in and the recording will capture everything we all say.
Yes, good morning. My name is Jairo Garcia. I'm Global Tech. I didn't see in your diagrams, but I saw in another presentation from your organization the amount of CO2 your projections for the CO2 in the environment that is go up to 40 billion metric tons of CO2. Is that correct?
In the reference case?
Yes.
We're currently, close to 7?
Yeah, my question is exactly, I mean, what role plays the amount of CO2? I mean, because 40 billion metric tons of CO2 is a big amount. A chunk is probably around 50% higher than the amount that we have in 2000. It will be around 400 parts per CO2 per million. So what role plays the CO2 in your projections, or you definitely discard that?
Well, in our reference case, people are going to understand is our reference case, we do what we call current laws and regulations. So in the reference case, there's no program to reduce CO2. So it's saying, based on current economics and growth in demand for energy, what would happen? So I think our current numbers are right around 7 billion a year for the total U.S., and energy-related might be about 4 or 5, and it grows to maybe, I think it grows to around 6 or so. It doesn't grow very fast. It's growing very slowly in our reference case. Only when we impose the bills like Waxman-Markey or Lieberman-Warner or those sorts of programs do we see the numbers fall as people start to invest. It's growing pretty slowly. I'm pretty sure it's not growing very fast in our reference case.
Is your question related to the change in the environment associated with a higher concentration of CO2? Well, the correct answer to that is no, we do not model environmental changes with, say, increased temperature might have an impact on end-use consumption patterns. No. We have a certain amount of climatic impact associated with
Energy demand and consumption.
Yes, how we're accounting for recent climatic effects, and also we show a net migration from colder climates to warmer climates generally, which has a tendency to decrease heating demands and increase cooling demands. So that's within the reference case, but in terms of an increase in cooling degree days or and decrease in heating degree days that were related to environmental impact, no, that's not included.
Van Horalkere. My question is, I see the sort of the flatness in the electricity usage in the overall. But we in the electronic, industry, we believe that the data centers, as they are increasing as the communication gets larger. Is there a group that is looking at the electricity usage in data centers?
You can dig. Let me tell you, you can dig into the detail of our model that will give you more data than you ever want to know. There's several hundred tables that come out of the model itself, so we're only scratching the surface. But in the commercial model and in the residential model, they do look down at the needs in data centers and things like that, and those demands are growing. But on the other hand, you have to also take into account that some of the other big uses that have always been there are falling. You can't, if you replace a refrigerator today, any one you buy today, and you're replacing this one that's 10 or 15 years old, is going to be maybe half what it used of the old one. And the similar things, because they're just more efficient. So those things are offsetting the increases in things like TVs and other electronics. And even the TVs are, from the ones they had a few years ago, are getting more efficient. So we do capture those trends, and you can look at those sorts of detail in the report. And if you go to the websites that I linked to there, you'll see you can get the breakdowns all the way down to how much in particular uses in particular households.
In addition to your specific issue having to do with data centers and their energy consumption, that particular topic was raised in the late 1990s. There was an article that came out in Forbes magazine, Dig More Coal, the PCs are coming. And that called for, or pointed out that there's this greater energy density within these data centers. EIA conducted, and it's included in these models, several analyses of that effect. And that's embedded in the national energy model. But essentially what the result was that even though the density of consumption was greater, the economic value of that more than offset that use, and the technology improvement in terms of the energy use within the data centers was also increasing because you had an opportunity to implement other types of technologies.
One small. Is that a microcosm of overall electricity usage, or is it growing so rapidly?
It's growing, but other things are offsetting.
I guess I have two questions. First, where did you get your cost on nuclear? And also, I was wondering if anybody had, just for fun, modeled the Pickens plan.
We have not modeled the Pickens plan. I can certainly answer that. Nuclear. A few years ago, we're like everybody else. We have to go out and get where we can find the best numbers around. Nobody can give you what it really costs because there's not been a huge number of ones built, particularly in the United States. A few years ago, we had all the vendors in. We had Westinghouse in, we had GE in. At that time, we had the Can-Do guys in from Canada too. And they came in, brought all their cost estimators in, and gave us just reams of reports on what they expected these plants to cost. And we went through all those numbers, and we thought those numbers would be about, this is probably 4 or 5 years ago, maybe 6 years ago, about $2,000 a kilowatt. And they told us we were way too high. And they wrote letters to us. Probably wrote letters to Jay, telling them they were way too high. And as you know, nobody believes those numbers are way too high today. Our numbers are closer to $4,000 a kilowatt today. We will go out, we try to review all the numbers we can find. We look at what our particular DOE offices put out, and we try to find as much as we can on commercial numbers that come out there. But can we come out with, that's why we do cases low and high, because nobody can tell you what those things are going to cost. Now, I will warn you one thing. When you see numbers in the papers all the time. Okay, I think I have the mic here. It's just down here. Okay. You see numbers in the papers all the time when all these projects are announced and things like that. And one of the most difficult parts is comparing apples to apples. Because sometimes the numbers include financing costs. Sometimes those numbers are nominal dollars, and that's really important about nuclear because they're talking about a plant that might be built 10 or 15 years out into the future. So now you're talking about it's got financing and it's 2018 or 2020 dollars. And so, and when they say that's $6,000 or $7,000, you work that back out into the real dollars, and you take out the financing, that number might be 25, 30% less than that. So you really have to be very careful when you look at various numbers that get thrown around with regard to those sorts of those. And you also don't know if they're including the transmission, they're including all the other things they have to do. So it's very hard, and we struggle with that. I'm not going to say it's easy. And do we think we have a perfect source? There isn't one.
All right, I'm trying to keep a little bit of geographic equity here. Back in sort of this corner of the room, is there anybody with a question? We want to. So where else? Here we go. All right, Jake.
Yeah, in the EIA analysis of Markey Waxman, there was a sentence that I thought came about as close to an editorial as I would see from EIA.
I didn't write it.
It was very muted. I said for EIA. It said that with the emphasis on offsets and giving away the carbon credits, that this kept prices low, but it also delayed a demand response, and so you don't see much demand response in the impact of Markey Waxman. But I don't think it's a defect in the EIA model. I think it's intended by the legislation to keep prices low, and therefore you don't get much demand response. I wondered if you wanted to elaborate on that.
Well, you get demand response in the sense that there are specific dollars associated with the allowances. In other words, a certain portion of the allowances in Waxman and Markey are the money associated with them when they auction them off, or whoever they give them to sell them and use the money, is to go to efficiency. But you don't get price-related demand response. In other words, you know, and this is a conundrum I think that regulators at least have been in for decades. They see their job as twofold. They want consumers, they want people to be fairly efficient, but they also want to minimize the price impacts on consumers. And those two things work against each other. If you don't allow people to see the costs of the energy sources they face, they won't necessarily see the same incentive to reduce consumption, and that's a tough thing. You know, look, I'm an economist. I always want them to see the true marginal cost of what they do, because I think that leads to the best allocation of resources. But regulators have a different job, and they have to deal with all those things.
So we have two questions from the web, from our webcast. The first question is, let's see if I can find it, is Michael, in your slides with respect to the projection of fuel systems for vehicles, I think there was an indication of fuel cells as a highlight, but there was not a fuel cell component of the graph. Is there something there where fuel cells are not going to be deployed by 2030? Or?
This is one of those questions where I'd love to be able to see the person who posted the question, and I appreciate them bringing that up. Yes, we do model the use of hydrogen fuels within the transportation sector, but under any of our range of cases, we see minimal market penetration of these technologies. EIA, I think late last year, released a service report requested by Senator Dorgan on hydrogen economy, impacts on climate change and other things. We looked we gave a rather detailed look at prospects for a hydrogen economy and its impacts on the transportation sector. And in general, what we saw was that even if all the technological breakthroughs occurred that were required to make hydrogen fuel cell vehicles cost competitive with any range of gas-fired or internal combustion engines, that market penetration wouldn't occur till after 2030, and therefore you're starting to look at timeframes of 2050 and beyond. But with that, I'd like to point out that there is a rather robust research and development program within the Department of Energy, which really didn't appreciate our service report. But given that, I'd like to point out that there is a hydrogen economy within the United States, and a good portion of it's located along the southeast United States. A large amount of hydrogen is produced and consumed at refineries for ultra-low sulfur diesel production. There's also a lot of hydrogen that's produced at chlor-alkali facilities, and there's a few other industrial sources of hydrogen. So if someone were looking for leveraging a near-term market penetration or a demonstration of the technology, a good bit of hydrogen production infrastructure already exists in the Southeast and doesn't need to be built from the ground up, say in California or Massachusetts.
Another question which came in was, Alan, in terms of your slides, the slide, I think there was the rate of change of electricity demand. Is that a slide based on national information, or is there something specific to the Southeast?
That one was national. Now, the growth has been a little higher in the Southeast. You know, where I think the numbers were U.S. In the 90s was about 2.4. I think the Southeast was about 3. Okay. Then I think in through the first 7 years of this decade, the U.S. dropped down to about 1.1. I think the Southeast has dropped down to about 1.5. Okay. So it's followed the same trends, but it's higher. The Southeast is growing faster, but it's following a similar trend. Our modeling is done at a 13 region level for the electricity demand, so we do differentiate that.
And just as a follow-on, is there a breakout of Florida? Right?
Yes, Florida is treated separately. So
and how would that compare, I suppose?
I don't know off the top of my head what Florida is. It was growing. Florida was growing faster because the population was growing in Florida, but over the last few years, that population growth rate has really slowed. In fact, they might have an outward migration. But we can get those numbers if anybody needs.
All right, we probably have time for one more question. Is there anybody on this side of the aisle? Let me reach in here.
Sam Schaal from the Strategic Energy Institute here at Georgia Tech. Quick question for you, Alan. Your $5,000 nuclear cost, did that include financing costs during construction?
No.
Okay. And Michael, you mentioned that your domestic oil production numbers included assumption of drilling off the Pacific and Atlantic coast. What % approximately is that production of the total?
It's approximately less than 10%, but we can provide the more exact numbers if you're looking for that. And that's driven by the fact that our best estimates of what's in the Pacific and the Atlantic are based on Minerals Management Service estimates, which are as a percentage of total crude oil available in the U.S., relatively small. In addition, those resource estimates that we get from MMS reflect fairly small field sizes, which are not exactly highly economic to develop. So the modeling shows one result. The industry momentum suggests another assumption about what's out there.
And my name's Bill Ewing, and one more question. What renewable energy sources do you see growing the most in the Southeast region?
Well, nationwide the trend has been, of course, heavily into wind. But in the Southeast, there is some wind, but probably the bigger area is biomass. And there's two areas for biomass. One of the easier renewable things is biomass co-firing in existing coal power plants. Of course, that becomes a problem when you're doing a climate change bill and those coal power plants maybe aren't running anymore because most of them you can't run purely on biomass. But biomass is probably the biggest source in the Southeast.
Just to follow up on that, one of the things we find in the biofuel side is that we're competing with the power side for feedstocks. In addition, our technologies often need to have rather refined biomass feedstocks, whereas all you need to do for biomass power is make sure it can burn, right?
All right. Well, we have run just a little bit over our time limit, so want to be sure we stick as close to that as we can, and thank everybody for attending, and thank you, gentlemen, for all of your remarks today. We really appreciate it. Please join me in thanking them.